Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. When I was visiting my parents a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that I was reading The Winning Basket on this podcast. Pleased, Dad shared with me this poem that seems very fitting for Ben's tale. It's one of the poems in a book called Reflections on a Gift of Watermelon Pickle, which is an anthology of poetry edited by Stephen Dunning, Edward Lueders, and Hugh Smith. The poem, Foul Shot, was written by Edwin A. Hoey, and here it is. Foul shot. With 2 60s stuck on the scoreboard and 2 seconds hanging on the clock, the solemn boy in the center of eyes, squeezed by silence, seeks out the line with his feet, soothes his hands along his uniform, gently drums the ball against the floor, then measures the waiting net, raises the ball on his right hand, balances it with his left, calms it with fingertips, breathes, crouches, waits, and then through a stretching of stillness, nudges it upwards. The ball slides up and out, lands, leans, wobbles, wavers, hesitates, plays at coy, until every face begs with unsounding screams, and then, right before roar up, drives down and through. What do you think? Does that fit this story? I think so. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Winning Basket by Duane Yarnell. Chapter 15. Grandstander. Once, twice more, Ben Mason broke loose and scored on plays that he should have had no part in. He leaped into the fray and retrieved balls that were not meant for him. He was bringing the roof down upon him, bringing dozens of insults down upon his ears, but he felt it was worth it. With the score at 29-23, Rod King called time out. In the huddle, he faced Ben. "What's the big idea, Mason? You're breaking up our plays. You've never tried to make all of the points before. What's gotten into you?" Ben could have said, "I'm breaking up your plays because you're trying to keep me out of them. Someone has to make the points, and if you won't play teamwork, then I'll be individual. You can call me grandstander or anything else you want. So long as I have to make the points, though, I'll make them." Instead, he said quietly, but with a hint of challenge in his tone, "I've decided I'm the one who can make the most points. I'm going to make them, and there's nothing you can do to keep me from it." That was enough to ignite the sparks of jealousy that existed on the team. The next time the ball went into play, the cadets swarmed down the floor with it. But Ben Mason didn't get the ball. Instead, it was tossed to Lassiter, who threw a long one-handed shot at the basket. But it scored, and the cadets were only 2 baskets behind the leaders. However, the visitors were not to be outdone, and they swarmed back for a score that widened the margin to 6 points again. Score: visitors 31, cadets 25. Ben managed to get the ball on the throw-in. He had an opportunity to pass to King, but passed it up in favor of dribbling down the floor himself. 2 Morningside men moved desperately in to try to block Ben's mad charge, but he turned on an extra burst of speed, lifted himself high into the air, flipped the ball away with a flick of his strong right wrist. For an instant, the gym resounded with ringing cheers as the cadets again pulled to within 2 goals of the leaders. But almost instantly the cheers were swallowed by roars of disapproval. "Grandstander!" the fans shouted. "Take the big show-off out of there!" Ben heard those jeers and half expected the coach to act upon them. But when the coach didn't, Ben continued his mad procedure. He knew it wasn't teamwork, but he was playing that way for a reason. He knew that he was making his mates angrier and angrier. He hoped this would cause them to try to outdo him. Once they did that, there would be no stopping the cadet steamroller. It wasn't a method Ben liked to use, but it seemed the only one that would apply in this case. So he continued to drive. Every time he got a chance, he took possession of the ball. He refused to pass to his mates. He dribbled like a wild man, but he dribbled with the finesse of a court veteran. Some of the times he was unable to get through the opposition guards, but at other instances he broke through for scores. Once the 4 other varsity men realized they were being outdone by Ben, they turned on the pressure in their own right. Lassiter scored frequently on passes from Rod and Hal and Lard. At the end of the period, there were but 3 points separating the teams. Hotter and hotter became the competition. The ball zipped up and back, with both teams driving ahead at full steam. The minutes melted until there were only 3 left. For a full minute, leading by 3 points, the visitors stalled. Then the cadets got the ball. They went into an attacking formation with the speed of an air squadron. They drove straight into enemy territory, and their clever passing attack pierced the strong defense for a score. This time the crowd went wild. Only 1 point separated the 2 teams. Morningside 39, Clearview 38, and only a minute left to play. 1 minute in which to make a basket that would leave the cadets in the championship race. The visitors brought the ball down carefully. There was a tenseness in the situation that clutched at every throat. The quiet patter of the dribbled ball sounded like cannon fire in the stilled gym, and on the scoreboard the second hand had miraculously cut the time to half a minute. In some manner, the cadets had to get that ball. Ben Mason knew it was now or never. He started a dash toward the ball, and then suddenly something was happening to him. A hazy film of gray came down over his eyes. The gym began to sway under his feet. He seemed to be losing balance. Tottering, weaving, he plunged on toward the man who was dribbling the ball. Ben Mason knew what was wrong. The loss of blood was now telling on him. A lump came up in his throat. He had gotten on this long, and now it seemed that when he most needed his strength, he must fail. But at that instant occurred one of the rare, unexplainable things that makes basketball the exciting game that it is. The Morningside man fumbled the ball, and it rolled free on the court floor. 6 players dived for it. The ball was kicked, slapped, and then it bounced free, and Ben Mason was in possession of it. From a long way off, it seemed miles to Ben, there was a roar of sound, a plea to shoot. Ben wheeled. The basket grew fainter. Grimly he set himself, prayed for strength enough to make an attempt to score. Slowly, so slowly that it seemed he would never beat the timer's gun, Ben brought the ball up. It left his fingers, soared higher and higher, then began to descend toward the netting. The ball rolled around the rim, fell in for the score. The gun crashed thunderingly through the gym, and the game was over. The cadets had won, and Ben Mason, fighting alone, and without the aid of his mates, had made the win possible. Later that evening, Ben was lying upon his bed in his dormitory. Because it was game night, the rules had been relaxed, and the cadets were allowed to leave their lights burning until midnight. Ben was tired and weak, but not sleepy. Ben was silently remembering the events of the past hour. Immediately after the game, he had fainted. He had lain there on the floor without assistance, although it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. As he came out of it, Coach Craig was just moving toward him. The coach had asked Ben if anything was wrong, but Ben had pushed his way into the dressing room, the first wave of weakness and sickness having passed. There, as he took a shower, he heard many mutterings. "I think it's a shame," Lassiter had said, "how we had to use him tonight. Talk about grandstanding. Every time he got the ball, he tried to shoot it." There were more uncomplimentary things. So Ben had gone to his dorm alone, with not even Rod King to comfort him. He had gone home and stepped out of his clothes and climbed into bed. Now, lying there, he wondered what awful thing was going to happen to him next. His every moment at Clearview had been dogged with trouble. Would it ever end? Would he ever emerge as a regularly accepted cadet? There came a sudden knock, and Ben called, "Come in." The door opened inward, and there was Coach Craig. There was a queer, pinched look on his face. "Hello, Mason. Mind if I come in and sit a while? I want to talk a few things over with you." Ben, feeling ill at ease, said, "Have a chair, sir." The cadet leader sat down, and without preliminary said, "Mason, there are a lot of things that puzzle me. One is this: what sort of a fellow are you? Why are you so mysterious about everything? One minute you seem to be the squarest fellow in the world, and the next minute you seem to be the strangest. I can't make you out." Why, I don't know exactly what you mean," Ben said. "I'll tell you what I mean. Tonight you came to the gym when we needed you. You came after I had already humiliated you in front of the squad. Other men would have sulked, but not you. Then, after you offered your services and the varsity refused them, you purposely made them angry at you, so that they would play harder. Those tactics won for us, Mason. You made them hate you so we could win. And there's something else I must tell you. I've talked to the ambulance driver that took Brown to the hospital. I've seen the blood on your coat. I'm putting 2 and 2 together, and I think I have an answer that adds up. You saved a life by giving your blood. You gave blood to a man who took your place on the varsity. And then you came back saying nothing about it. You're an odd one, Mason. I'm not going to pry into your personal affairs. There's something behind your actions that you're trying to cover. But someday I hope to get to the bottom of things. I hope to see you an accepted member of the squad. I want to help you, but you refuse to let me. Are you still unwilling to take me into your confidence? Aren't you going to give me a chance to know the real Ben Mason so that I can judge you for myself?" Ben smiled involuntarily. "You're doing what you think is right," Ben said softly, "but I'm afraid I'll have to fight my own battles until things take a turn for the better. There's a lot involved here that's personal, things that have nothing at all to do with school. Thanks for being interested, but if you don't mind, I'll keep my own counsel." The coach shook his head sadly, but he didn't get up to leave. Instead, he said, "Ben, you purposely made enemies with the varsity, and it worked. Now I'm going to ask you to make an even greater sacrifice. Next, we're meeting Navy Prep. We have to beat them, and the only possible chance to beat them is with you in the game. We need your ability. I've already seen that it's impossible for you to work in harmony with the entire varsity, so I'm making a request. Do you understand what I'm about to say?" "I understand," Ben admitted. "You want me to go on as I've started. You want me to keep the varsity angry with me so that they'll play harder, trying to outdo me." "That's it exactly," the coach said excitedly. "I'm asking you to risk your future in order that the team may benefit. If I didn't know you were a soldier, Ben, I wouldn't dare make the request. A weakling couldn't stand up under it. But you're not a weakling. At least, that's the conclusion I've reached. In asking, I realize that I'm putting you up against a difficult situation. You have a perfect right to refuse if you wish." Ben Mason sat there on his bed, with eyes half closed. He was seeing not his own problems, but those of the team. He was thinking in terms of the great spirit of the academy, of the splendid traditions that made one proud to be a member of the varsity basketball team. And thinking that way made it easy for Ben to submerge his personal desires. "I'm not refusing you, sir," Ben said quietly. "I'm going to play just as I did tonight. I'm going to make baskets, and then I'm going to challenge the others to match them. It won't be pleasant, perhaps, but if it will beat Navy Prep—" Ben broke off there. The coach got up, extended Ben his hand. Ben's throat felt tight as he felt the firm, confident grip of the coach's fist. He swelled with pride as Craig said, "I want you to know one thing, Mason. Never so long as I have coached have I ever asked so much of a man as I'm asking of you. And never have I been more confident that you'll come through for me. Good night. This is the last I'll say to you about this. You have your assignment, and you're on your very own." During the next few days, Ben Mason carried out his assignment faithfully. In practice, he played the role of the lone wolf. In the classroom, he sat silently, while his mates openly called him a grandstander. It was bitter medicine, but it was exactly as Ben had known it would be. The night before the game with Navy Prep, John Harrigan visited Ben. His stay was brief. He had been in to see Jack Lassiter and wanted to see Ben a moment before leaving. John Harrigan did not mince words. "Ben, I'm hearing strange tales about you. Furthermore, I've been seeing things also. You never impressed me as being a show-off before. You always seemed cooperative, but suddenly you begin to play basketball as if you're the only one on the team. What can that get you, Ben?" "I'm sorry you feel as you do," Ben said softly. "I'd give anything to keep your goodwill. But all I can say is that I have a good reason for doing what I do." For the first time, John Harrigan smiled. "Hold on there, my boy. I didn't say you didn't have my goodwill. And if you have a reason, then you must be right. But you gave me a scare. It was like waking up and finding that something you had wanted badly had turned into a dream. Well, good night, Ben, and good luck against Navy Prep." The Navy Prep team was a tall, rangy outfit. They would have a reach of several inches per man on the cadets. And reach, in basketball, is sometimes almost as important as speed. But the cadets had one thing in their favor. They were the underdogs. And it is well known in sports that the team least favored to win has the psychological advantage, because they have more to gain by the victory. Just before the tap, the 5 cadets met in a hand-locked huddle. "We're going to win this one," Rod King said, "and we're going to win it by playing together. Is that understood?" Ben knew that every time he made them angry, he was making it more and more difficult to ever be friendly with them. Yet he remembered the promise he had made his coach. "Keep them angry at you," the coach had said. "Make them try to outplay you. Give them something to shoot at." So now, in the restrained tenseness of the pre-game huddle, Ben Mason said through clenched teeth, "I'm playing this game as I see fit. I want to win it too, so I'll make all the baskets I can. Get that, all of you guys." Lassiter snarled something under his breath. Hal Chase frowned, and Rod King just looked alarmed. "If there's any grandstanding," Rod said, "the coach'll jerk you out in a minute. See if he won't." "We'll leave that up to the coach," Ben snapped. The whistle blasted, and the 2 centers moved into the circle. Pandemonium broke loose as the referee tossed the ball high into the air. Rod King strained high into the air, his fingers clutching, reaching, and then he touched the leather sphere, batted it toward Lassiter. Lassiter leapt high, gained possession, and immediately began to dribble toward the basket. As he reached the free throw circle, about 15 feet away from the net cords, Lassiter attempted a push shot, but a long tapering arm from the Navy prep defense reached out and snagged the ball away from Lassiter. "Nice going," Ben taunted. "All we have to do to lose this game is to see that you get the ball every time." He saw Lassiter go white under the taunt. That wasn't Ben's idea of the way to talk, but he knew that it was for a purpose. He would do anything fair, so long as the cadets were able to win. Anything, to the extent of sacrificing his own inner feelings. A cadet never complained. The Navy prep man began a mad dash down the court in his own right. He was in mid-floor before Ben reached him. Ben, taking a chance of touching the man and thereby fouling him, ran alongside of him. Then, swift as a striking cobra, his hand flicked out. His palm slapped the ball, and when he jerked away, he had cleverly stolen the ball. Ben whirled. The move had caught the prepsters unaware. Ben was driving swiftly back toward his own goal before the other team could organize to stop him. Lassiter was under the goal. Ben could have passed to him and made the basket sooner, but he was remembering what he must do. He must forget teamwork for the present. He simply had to seem like a grandstander so that the other varsity men would be annoyed. So Ben dribbled on in, executed a neat push-up shot, and the home club was leading by a 2-0 count. Once again the stands arose en masse. "Grandstander!" they roared. "Take that show-off out of there!" Down on the playing court, Rod King looked toward the bench. There was a puzzled, strained look on his face. He couldn't seem to understand why the coach was leaving Ben in the game. But Coach Craig made no move. "You think you can grab all the glory?" Lassiter hissed. "You think you'll be a hero by making all the points? Well, listen to me, plebe. I'm in this game too. I'll show you what real basketball looks like. See if I don't." On the very next play, Jack Lassiter stole the ball from a Navy prep man. He passed neatly to Rod, then drove for the end of the court. Rod bounced a pass to Lard. Under the basket, Ben and Lassiter both broke away from their guards. But Lard ignored Ben. The pass went to Lassiter, and the flashy cadet forward made a sensational overhand shot, and the cadets were then leading by a 4-0 count. But then the Navy boys really began to roll. They came down the court in a wave, sweeping aside all opposition. They counted a field goal from the center, a free throw, and then another field goal. When the cadets called timeout, Navy prep had gone into a 5-4 lead. "We've got to stop these guys," Rod King pleaded. "That means we'll have to play even harder than we're playing now. Mason, I'm talking to you now. How about getting that grandstanding business out of your head?" "Maybe," Ben said, "and maybe not." The blast from the timer's whistle cut short any further conversation. The quarter found them tied, and at halftime, the cadets were trailing by only a basket. Leaving the court, Ben lagged a bit behind. He had made most of his team's points, but he had been soundly booed for it. The other varsity men were already in the dressing room. Coach Craig stepped up behind Ben. "You're doing a wonderful job," the coach whispered, "but you'll have to do even better later on. The Navy boys will play inspired basketball this next half." Then a faraway look came into the coach's eyes. "What wouldn't I give," he said, "to be able to see all 5 of you playing together. This keeping the others mad is only a substitute, Ben. Later on this season, by the time we play Corona again, I want to see all 5 of you fellows playing a game for a common cause. I want to see you use teamwork. When that happens, I'll be seeing a really great basketball team in action. You fellows, if you played together, could be the slickest team in the state." "Someday," Ben said solemnly, "I hope you do get your wish. There's nothing in the world I'd rather do than play with them as you suggest. But the way matters now stand, that isn't possible. Please believe me." "I believe you," the coach muttered, "but I don't understand you. This is the first team I've ever coached that I didn't know what was going on. It's amazing." The team rested while the coach pointed out errors of the first half. But Craig was careful not to mention the lack of teamwork and cooperation. As for the varsity, they simply sat and glared at Ben. Ben looked at the ceiling and ignored them as best he could. But the half started off badly. As the game's speed quickened, the play grew rougher. The cadet team was riddled time and again by the jarring surges of the visitors. Navy Prep went into a 33-26 lead as the last and most important period opened. In the rest period, there had been a dramatic happening. "If we don't play better," Rot had exclaimed, "we're going to lose. That will mean the end of our championship hopes." Ben Mason could hold himself back no longer. The game meant as much or more to him than it did to the others. Grimly he faced them. "I've tried to play with you," he said, "but you refused to let me. Very well, from now on, I'm playing by myself. I'm going to dribble down for goal after goal. If you don't want me to try to score, you'd better keep the ball away from me. Somebody has to win this game, and it may as well be me." Ben Mason had made that flat statement, and now, as the last period began, he sought to carry it out. He became at once a driving fury. He broke up long shots as well as short ones. He was in on every play, fighting, lunging, straining for the ball. He made basket after basket. He ignored the threats of his mates and the booing from the stands. He had only one desire, and that was to spark his team to win. 1 minute to go, and the score was tied. 30 seconds, 20, 10, and Ben Mason with the ball at last, dribbling wildly toward the distant goal. Across the center line, deep into enemy territory. The timer's gun upraised, then the shot when every fan was paralyzed with tense expectancy. The score going up as the ball trickled through. The end of the game that assured the cadets of a chance at the title. But strangely, the real hero of the game was forced to leave the court to the accompaniment of thousands of taunts. "Grandstander!" they chanted. "Grandstander!" And Ben Mason, head bowed and heart heavy, walked slowly from the court. Chapter 16. The Missing Money. Later, after the squad had dressed, Coach Craig called them into his office. When they were all seated, he addressed them. "Fellows, we're forgetting everything now but the game with Corona. We're tied with them, and if we can defeat them this next time, the championship is ours. But we must remember one thing. The game will be played there, and it's always a handicap to be playing away from home. I'm not telling you what to do from now on. I feel you know as much as I can teach you. I've explained all the rules to you, and you know what I expect in the way of training. Just keep eating well and getting plenty of sleep." The coach was interrupted when the door swung wide open. A uniformed cadet handed the coach a large white envelope. "Here's the athletic department's share of the receipts for tonight," the cadet said. "It comes to almost $200. The coach took the envelope and smiled at it. "Well, men," he said, "here's the money to pay for our trip to Corona." The coach opened his desk drawer and put the envelope inside. "I guess it'll keep here until I can put it in the school bank on Monday. Well, fellows, I haven't anything else to say to you. You're on your own until Monday's practice session." Ben left earlier than the rest of the men. He went down immediately toward his dorm. But halfway there he suddenly realized that his cap was missing. He turned and went back to the gym. A few spectators were still filing out and discussing the hard-fought game. Ben entered the gym, walked back to the dressing room. He searched in his locker for his cap, but it wasn't there. Then he remembered the talk in the coach's office. When Ben knocked on the office door, there was no answer. He tried the knob and it opened. Inside, he turned on the lights and found his cap, hanging where he had left it. Ben took the cap and, switching off the lights, departed. In the hallway as he left, he came face to face with President Smathers and several members of the squad. The president saw Ben and said, "I was just congratulating the boys on their victory. The same goes for you, Mason. It was a fine game." "Thank you, sir," Ben said. "I just came back to get my hat." Ben departed and went straight to his dorm. When he reached there, he found a rather welcome surprise awaiting him. A young cadet saluted Ben, not because Ben was a superior, but because he was a varsity man and lived in an upper-class dorm. "I hear you have a camera for sale," the cadet said. "I'm taking a course in photography, and my lens isn't good enough. I was wondering if you'd let me examine your camera." "Sure," Ben said. "Come right inside and I'll show you." They entered the room, and Ben got his camera. For an instant, he felt as if he could never part with it, for it had been his welcome companion on dozens of long walks through the woods. But when he remembered how strongly he wanted the money, he knew that selling the camera would be the only way of getting it. So Ben began to point out the camera's best features. Finally, the cadet said, "It's worth the money, all right. I have the $50 with me. Would you care to let me have it tonight, or do you have film in it?" "It's yours right now," Ben said, handing the camera over. Then he took the money and bade the young cadet good evening. Quickly, Ben went to his desk, unlocked the top drawer. The drawer contained the money that had been refunded Ben, plus his monthly allowance of $50. With the camera money, he had enough to get the investigation started. He quickly wrote a letter to the company, and then he remembered that he didn't have a stamp. Hearing voices in the hallway outside, he walked to the door and opened it. Lassiter and Hal Chase were walking toward the stairway. "Do either of you fellows happen to have a stamp?" Ben asked. Hal Chase came forward. He opened his billfold, and in one of the pockets he found a stamp. For a moment, Hal and Lassiter stood outside Ben's doorway, while Ben searched for 3 pennies to pay for the stamp. Lassiter's eyes caught the money lying on Ben's desk. "Looks like you just robbed a bank," Lassiter commented. "I guess you got the money you've been wanting for so long." "I got it," Ben admitted, "tonight." Lassiter and Chase left, once the business transaction was made. Ben went to bed, and almost immediately he fell asleep. It was on Monday morning that the bombshell burst upon the campus. Usually, chapel was held on Wednesday, but on Monday, the entire cadet force was summoned up to the chapel steps by the sudden tolling of a bell. Ben went along, as puzzled as the rest of the cadets. The academy's president was grave-faced as he ascended the rostrum. He cleared his throat, gazed wonderingly down upon the student body. Finally he said, "Gentlemen of Clearview Academy, I have been the presiding officer of this great institution for more than 30 years. I have seen thousands of young men pass through our halls and corridors. Many of them, of course, have had faults, but they have also had honor. Never until today has it been my misfortune to hear that we are harboring a criminal within our walls. For the first time since I took office, I am forced to stand here and admit that one of the cadets in this academy is a thief." The response was electric. There was a stunned silence, a silence shattered by a static buzzing. Upperclassmen, after the first startled jolt, glared about them, their eyes ferreting out the guilty cadet. Plebes sat there in silent confusion, staring at one another in disbelief. "The thief," the president continued, "stooped so low that he stole the money that was to have financed the basketball trip to Corona. After the Navy prep game, a large sum of money was taken into Coach Craig's office. There it was to be kept over the weekend. This morning, that money was gone." President Smathers continued, "I'm going to make one offer. If the cadet who stole that money has the courage to face the student body, if he will return it and publicly admit his wrongs, I will see to it that he retains his school citizenship. It is one thing to make a mistake, and quite another to have the fortitude to admit it. I'm asking the thief to come up here and show that he is repentant. Well, I am waiting." Ben Mason listened to all of this, and he was as perturbed as the rest. But what suddenly made him more than perturbed was to look up and see that many eyes were upon him. There was accusation in those glances, accusation, hate, contempt. With a sickening feeling, he realized what those glares meant. For an instant, he wanted to jump up upon a chair, wanted to shout, "I've been called a garage mechanic, an orphan, a grandstander, and lots more things. I've taken them because I've felt that someday I'd be able to prove that you were all wrong. But now you're calling me a thief, and that's too much." But Ben said nothing. He realized instinctively that to say such a thing would appear to everyone else as an admission of guilt. So Ben, his face a burning red, sat there and tried to return their glares. "It is very clear," the president said, "that the thief lacks the necessary courage to make a clean breast of the whole matter. Very well, I shall withdraw my offer. The thief can expect no further leniency from my office. Good day." Swiftly the students departed. Outside they congregated in small groups, and their eyes were still narrowed in anger as they discussed the news. As for Ben, he started for his dorm, but he didn't reach it. A plebe tapped him on the arm, handing him a note. For some reason, Ben was suddenly trembling. Clumsily he unfolded the note and read, "I wish to speak to you at once. I am waiting for you in my office. This is a command interview. President Smathers." With heavy steps, Ben began to move toward the administration building. In his heart, he knew the nature of the coming interview. The only thing was to get it over. President Smathers scowled as Ben entered his office. He motioned him into a chair. Then, without a word of explanation, he handed Ben a letter. The letter was short and to the point, and as he read it, he felt his heart turning to ice. "Dear President Smathers, I hate to be an informer, but I feel that it is my duty to help clear the names of the innocent cadets. I have information that I believe will help in clearing up the matter of the theft of the money. Shortly after the basketball game with Navy Prep, a basketball player was seen coming out of the coach's office. This basketball player is a new man in school this year. I will not name him, but I do not believe this is necessary. If this information is responsible for helping to clear up this mystery, I will feel that I have done a good turn. Yours sincerely, a cadet." Ben handed the note back. His face was crimson. The president spoke the first words. "This note was given to me before I called the special chapel meeting this morning. As you see, it is typewritten, and it would take considerable time to discover the identity of the sender. However, since the mystery wasn't cleared in the chapel, there was nothing for me to do but to call you in. I may as well be frank with you, Mason. If I didn't know that this note meant you, there would be another way of arriving at that conclusion. Do you remember that night after the game? I went back to congratulate some of the boys on their victory, and I saw you leaving the coach's office. You spoke to me. What have you to say about that, Mason?" "There's only one thing to say," Ben answered. "You have not gone so far as to accuse me of this theft, and you have no right to until you are sure of your grounds. But it is obvious that you think me guilty, and there's nothing I can do about that except tell you that I am not." "But you admit that you were in the coach's office?" "I was there," Ben said. "You saw me, as you say." "And the coach was not there. The office was empty when you went in and empty when you came out." "That is correct," Ben stated. He was telling the truth, but instead of giving him a feeling of relief, as the truth usually does, it only seemed to involve him deeper. "You were in the coach's office alone, and you admit that you knew the money was in that desk drawer. You saw the coach put it there, didn't you?" Yes, I knew the money was there," Ben answered. "But you insist you didn't take it." Ben shrugged resignedly. "I think that should be fairly clear by now. I didn't take the money." The president scowled darkly, paced the room. Suddenly he whirled, pointed an accusing finger at Ben. "If you didn't take the money, where did you get the money you had in your room the night of the game?" Ben remembered the scene that had taken place when he had bought the stamp from Hal. He remembered how Lassiter had seen the money and had made mention of it before leaving. "I'm not denying that I had money," Ben said. "Part of it was from the sale of my camera. Part of it I saved. Then, $500 was from the money that was returned to me after John Harrigan paid my regular tuition. All of it amounted to $600. The money was spent for a good cause." "What did you do with the money?" the president asked. Ben was on the verge of explaining where the money had gone, and then his pride asserted itself. He was not guilty. They could not prove that he was guilty. Therefore, he did not feel that it was his place to present an alibi. He looked up quietly and said, "I spent the money. That's all I can tell you." "Mason," the president said, "if you insist that you had nothing to do with the theft, then there is nothing more I can say to you. Now." The now had an ominous ring, a ring that warned Ben that the president expected to have more to say later. Ben got up. He bowed courteously, then turned and left. When he opened the door that led into the hall, he got a shocked surprise. At least a half of the student body stood there in a large group. When they saw Ben, there was a distinct hush. Then, far back in the crowd, someone said, "There's the thief!" Suddenly, Ben Mason could contain himself no longer. He stood there, hands on hips, facing them. "If the man who said that will step out here and say it to my face, I'll thrash him to within an inch of his life." Under the spell of the threat, the accuser remained discreetly silent. Ben glared at the entire group. Then, sure that none was there to challenge him, he turned. As he did so, a secretary stepped from the office and pinned a note on the bulletin board. Ben stopped a moment and read it. "If the money stolen from Coach Craig's office is not returned by morning, the president of this academy will invite the police into the case. The police will be given full charge, and when the guilty party is discovered, the thief will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The thief can save this academy a lot of unwanted publicity by surrendering the money before morning." As Ben moved away, someone said, "Now, Mason, what do you think about that? How will you act when the cops come?" Ben recognized the man who spoke, but a sudden thought came to him, and he knew that there was no point in challenging this man to a fight. Instead, he smiled for the first time that day. "Why, I think it would be a splendid idea if the police were called in. I hear they're pretty efficient. If they came into the case, they will find the guilty party, As far as I'm concerned, I think that would be the best thing that could happen. It would undoubtedly be a surprise to everyone if the guilty man turned out to be someone other than the plebe who is now suspected." Ben whirled and walked hurriedly from the place, but he was aware of the awe-stricken silence that followed him. It was evident his words had given some of them cause to wonder. But Ben Mason was in for another rude shock. It was shortly before basketball practice that he received a summons from the student body president. Ben went to the student council room and was surprised to see a dozen uniformed cadets there. When Ben was seated, the student body leader arose and said, "Mason, when a cadet is under a dark cloud of suspicion, or when he breaks important college rules or laws, the student council has the power to render punishment. Right now we believe you have refused to cooperate fully in the matter of explaining what you did with certain monies. Therefore, it is the duty of this council to punish you. The worst thing that can happen to you, a thing worse even than being expelled, is now being enacted by this council. Ben Mason, until such time as this council sees fit, you are hereby silenced. The silence code is brief. You will not be allowed to speak to anyone, or be spoken to by anyone save your faculty leaders. Failure to comply with this code will mark you as an undesirable, and you will immediately be placed on trial before the council and the faculty board at the next joint meeting. Failure usually causes the guilty party to be banished from the campus." Ben Mason had heard the dreaded silence. He knew it was positively the worst thing that could befall a cadet. "I'm sorry you feel as you do," Ben began. "Silence, plebe!" Not to speak, not to be spoken to. As Ben left, his heart was heavier than he had ever remembered it. Chapter 17. The Agency's Report. Ben Mason continued to work out with the team, but while he was on the floor there were no words exchanged. The rest of the squad ignored him entirely. The bulletin of President Smathers was posted in the morning. That evening, after basketball practice, the president came down to the gymnasium. None of the team had had time to leave, and he found them while they were all together. "Men," he said gravely, "I have an announcement that will undoubtedly interest you. The money has turned up. It was found in the campus mailbox in a plain, unaddressed envelope. Because of this, I have decided not to call in the police. There will be no scandal outside the school. However, the matter will be investigated through my office, and if the guilty person can be found, he will have to suffer the consequences." Was Ben just being oversensitive, or was it true the eyes of the rest of the varsity were upon him? Was it true that they were thinking that he had become afraid and sent the money back to keep the police from investigating the happening? If they felt that way about it, then it was a cinch they would continue to blame him for the theft until the guilty party was really found. And that meant something else. The code of silence would not be lifted until then. For 4 more days, Ben trod the campus in silence. Then, on Thursday evening, he left for the commons to eat. He was not hungry, but he knew that his eating was necessary if he were to be in the best of condition for Saturday's battle against Corona. Ben left through a side door. Just as he stepped out, a young boy wearing the uniform of the local special delivery service entered through the front door. Ben had no time to linger, for most of the men had already left the dormitory, and Ben did not wish to be late. The messenger boy looked up and down the hallway as he entered. He heard footsteps, and when he turned, he saw 2 cadets walking toward the exit. The cadets, although he didn't know it, were Jack Lassiter and Lard Adams. "Say, soldier," the boy piped, "could you tell me where I could find a guy named Mason? I got a special delivery letter for him, and I'd kinda like to get it delivered so I can go home." "He was here just a minute ago," Lassiter said. Then, growing curious, Lassiter looked at the letter. He saw that it was from a large city, and when he read the return address, Acme Investigation, something inside him seemed to turn over. "Look, kid," Lassiter said, "does this letter have to be delivered to Mason? Isn't there some other way?" "It's got to be handed to the guy it's addressed to." "I was thinking," Lassiter said, "that maybe if you gave the letter to me, I could hand it to him. You see, I'm ranked above Mason, so it would be all right if I kept the letter for him. That way you could go on home without having to wait." The youngster was obviously puzzled by the talk, but at the same time he was giving plenty of consideration to the matter that would allow him to go home without waiting. Finally he scratched his head, muttered, "Well, I reckon it's safe. You got on a uniform. You kind of work for Uncle Sam, too. Here, take the letter. Sign here on this line." When the boy was gone, and Lassiter and Lard were standing there in the hallway alone, Lard said, "Now you've done it. What's the idea taking that letter? Don't you know it might get you into plenty of trouble? You can't go around claiming letters that belong to others. Not special letters." "Ah, shut up," Lassiter snapped. "Don't you see who this is from? It's from an investigation agency, that's where. What would Ben Mason want to have investigated unless—" Lard Adams suddenly colored. Then his face drained of color and turned the shade of chalk. Why, maybe he hired an investigation agency to come here and look into that missing money. Maybe that letter contained something about the guys who did it. I told you we shouldn't—" "Quiet," Lassiter exclaimed. "We didn't steal the money. We never intended to keep it, and you know it. When I saw Mason with all that money that night, I thought he had stolen it. I went to the coach's office to find out. When the money was still there, I decided you and I could hide it, and they would blame Mason. All I wanted was for Mason to get kicked out of school. How was I to know the president would threaten to call in the cops? How was I to know that Mason would get his spunk up and call in an outside company to find the guilty ones? You got me into this, Lassiter. You get me out." "Somebody's coming," Lassiter whispered. "Come on, let's duck into your room." Lassiter had torn open the envelope. The letter was in one hand and the envelope in the other. He wadded the envelope and tossed it into a corner wastebasket. They stepped into Lard's room and closed the door. It was Lassiter who read the letter first, and as his eyes drank in the message, his heart began to pump furiously, and his face blanched of color. Lard, seeing him, said, Did they find out who got the money?" His voice shook. "Worse than that. A lot worse. You ought to read this letter. Here, take it. If you ever let anyone see it, your name will be mud. This has to be a secret." The letter that Lard read went as follows. Acme Investigation Agency. Dear Mr. Mason, after much difficulty, our trained investigators discovered that you were once signed into the Central State Orphanage. The orphanage has since been discontinued, but the woman who was in charge still lives nearby. She had saved several boxes of old records, and among the records was a small envelope that had your name written on it. Inside was a small gold locket that you evidently wore when you were taken to the institution. The locket contained a picture of a soldier in uniform. This puzzled us a bit until we lifted the picture out. There, on the inside, we found a perfectly preserved fingerprint. We flew to Washington, and from the War Department files, we discovered that the owner of the print was really Walter Harrigan, the son of John Harrigan in your city. The picture in the locket proved the identification beyond a doubt. Knowing the importance of this discovery, we checked further into the matter, and this is how we reconstruct the events. Walter Harrigan was shell-shocked. In the chaos of the war, he disappeared from his hospital in France. His mind was a total blank. He was reported as one of the thousands of missing men, but he was not killed. He returned to America after the Great War, and his instinct led him back to this section. He settled in the Green Hills, 300 miles from his original home. He had adopted the name of Mason. He married a woman from a fine middle-class family. You were born to them. Your father evidently wanted to leave a record of his identity, and that was why he left you the locket with his print in it. This makes you the blood grandson of John Harrigan. There is no doubt that this is true. Because of John Harrigan's high position, we are withholding this information from the public. It is up to you to tell him at your own convenience. We look forward to serving you again. Acme Investigation Agency. Boy, Lard exclaimed, what a jolt this is! So that's what Mason wanted with the money. Well, it looks like it was money well spent. He's now the grandson of the richest man in this state. He'll never have a thing to worry about again. Ah, shut up! You fool, do you think I'll let him see this letter? If he sees it, my goose is cooked, and you know it. John Harrigan is looking for a young man to take his place when he retires. If I can get Mason to run away from here so that he can't be found easily, Harrigan will turn to me. I'll hide this letter and say nothing. Mason is bound to break under the strain of what he's going through. He won't stay around here long. I'm not so sure about that, Lard said slowly. He's stuck so far. I'm telling you, Lassiter, that Mason has more stuff than any man I ever knew. Sometimes I think it's an awful dirty trick treating him as we do. He seems to be a real swell guy, and he's as square as he can be. Why, what are you trying to do, make me feel like a heel? Jack Lassiter exclaimed angrily. Do you think I like this business any better than you? But we've both gotten into it now, and there's no point in backing out, unless we want to get caught for sure. Just the same, Jack, I wish I hadn't gotten into it with you. It's a nasty business, and I don't like a bit of it. Forget it, will ya? Now come on, we're getting out of here. I'm going to hide this letter, where no one will ever find it. The investigation agency has closed the matter as far as they're concerned. Later, maybe I'll send some kind of a fake letter to Mason. A letter that'll be full of bad news. That should keep him a while. The pair departed, and for a while the dormitory was empty. But it was not empty for long. Ben Mason returned early, for he hadn't enjoyed his meal. You couldn't concentrate on food when hundreds of cadets were pointing to you, when hundreds of men you had tried to become friendly with were right now calling you a thief. So Ben had finished early, and now he was back. Ben entered the dorm. His eyes were suddenly misty with emotion. He stumbled down the hall, half dark now because the rooms were dark. His foot kicked the wastebasket, and he sprawled. Papers were all around him. With a shrug, Ben picked himself up off the floor. He had begun to pick up the papers when something caught his eye. It was a crumpled envelope, upon whose face there reposed a new stamp issue. Ben Mason had made a hobby of collecting stamps. This one interested him because he had never seen it before. He uncrumpled the envelope and took it into his room. There he snapped on the light. He looked at the stamp, and it wasn't until he was carefully peeling it off the envelope that he saw that it had been addressed to him. That's funny, Ben mused. I didn't get a special delivery. When was this sent? It was then that Ben got his jolt. The letter was postmarked through the local office at 5 o'clock that very evening. Ben did some fast figuring. He knew that he had been there until time for supper, and the letter hadn't arrived up to then. I left, and the letter arrived afterward, he said half aloud. "I went to supper, and somebody stayed behind and took the letter in my place. 2 fellows missed that training table tonight, and they were Lard Adams and Jack Lassiter. They didn't eat out in the regular dining hall, because the coach wouldn't have allowed that. If they weren't at supper, then they could have been here. I hate to think it, but the fact remains that it could have been one of them or both." Ben paced the floor. What to do? He was restricted by a code of silence. He did not dare to talk to Lassiter and Adams, not unless he broke the code, and that could cause him all kinds of grief. Still, hadn't he had grief enough as it was? Could anything be worse than that which he was already going through? Besides, the letter had been from the investigation agency, and the letter was gone. What had been the contents of the message? Had Ben's parentage been traced? Those questions kept hammering in his brain. He had paid $600 of his own money in order to learn the answers to those questions. Was he to stand aside and be robbed of those answers, simply because of a code of silence that had been inflicted upon him? Of course he didn't dare talk to Lassiter while others were around. That would bring trouble down upon him before he could find out what he wanted. No, Ben would have to take his time, and so he began to pace the floor and to wait. Lassiter came in, but Lassiter was with Lard and other members of the team. They went into Lassiter's room and stayed there until after the warning lights dimmed. Only after they were gone, after the lights were turned out, did Ben finally decide to do the thing he had been thinking. He waited until the first guard period was over. Then, when the guard went upstairs, Ben slipped out and walked to Lassiter's room. He knocked, and at Lassiter's startled "Come in," Ben entered. Ben was carrying a flashlight. He pulled the door curtain so that the light would not penetrate to the hallway. Then he faced Lassiter. "I hear you have something to say to me," Ben said quietly. "I'm waiting to hear you say it." Lassiter gave a startled gasp. He climbed out of bed. What would I have to say to you? Listen, dummy, you're silenced. Do you want to be reported? Get out of here before I turn you in. I mean business, plebe." "I hear you have a letter of mine," Ben said. Ben knew that Lassiter was a smooth one, that his only chance to catch him in any kind of an admission would be to surprise him suddenly. So he repeated the words. Then, before Lassiter could recover, he held the flashlight to the envelope. "If you didn't take the letter out of this envelope while I was at supper tonight, why would your fingerprints be on it? You talk about reporting me. How long do you think it will be before I report you?" Ben started to move away, but Lassiter sprang toward him, clutched his arm. "Don't report me," he said. "I'll admit it. Yes, I got your letter, but I didn't realize that—" "Where's the letter?" Ben demanded, holding out his hand. Lassiter swallowed hard. I burned it. I was afraid to keep it. Look, Mason, you and I have been enemies for a long time. I haven't liked you, and you knew why. I tried to hate you and tried hard, but I never really hated you. Tonight, when I saw that letter, I took it. Not because I wanted it, but because I was curious. I read it, and, well, Mason, I'm sorry for you, that's all. If you want to report me, go ahead." Ben was surprised at the sudden change that had come over Lassiter. "I don't understand, Lassiter. Why are you sorry for me?" "Why? Oh, skip it. I guess I didn't mean that." "You're covering something," Ben said flatly. "You know what was in that letter, and now you're trying to deny it." "I don't want to tell you what was in it," Lassiter insisted. "I'd rather cut my tongue out than have to tell you." Ben gripped Lassiter's arm, said in a stern voice, Tell me before I choke it out of you." "Okay, Mason, I will. I'll tell. The investigation agency found out about you. Your father was an escaped convict. That was why I burned the letter. I didn't want you to see it. I wouldn't want my worst enemy to know that his father was an escaped convict and a deserter from the army. I tried to shield you from the news, Mason. I knew it would stamp you even worse than you're already stamped. All along I've not been sure that you stole that money, but if the contents of that letter ever got out, you would have been ruined for sure. I didn't want to hurt you, the school, or John Harrigan. I'm sorry now that I've even told you. It would have been better if I'd let you find out yourself." Slowly, Ben's fingers relaxed. He began to slump. His brain began to whirl dizzily. So this was what he had paid his money to learn? Better 1,000 times to have given his money to charity and completely ignored his background. Now, how could he ever hold up his head again? His father, an army deserter, an escaped convict. For the first time since Ben Mason could remember, tears began to stream down his cheeks. He extended his hand toward Lassiter. "Thanks, Jack. Thanks for trying to spare me. You've proved that you're made of the right stuff." Ben crept back to his room, his heart a heavy lump within his chest. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to The Winning Basket. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.